Well, welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. So the week has been interesting. You know, when I left class after last week, and in the morning I was making coffee and I was listening to the radio, and I heard this story come on about news deserts, and I thought, well, that's interesting. So I wonder who's doing that, and it turned out to be Marketplace. That's public radio stations now doing this series on news deserts, and then I went upstairs to read the paper, and there was this big article in the Philadelphia Inquirer about news deserts, and I thought, this seems to be a trend. Like, people seem to be talking about this suddenly. And then there was a third article that I read about it. So there was definitely things happening last week. I don't know, it was like sort of psychic occurrence or something.
What was the name of that town in Texas?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, thank you for reminding me, because that was
the one that just got destroyed.
that was the other thing. It was Canadian Texas. And you remember that we learned about that last week on the PBS show that we looked at, and that they were bemoaning the fact that, actually celebrating the fact that the last time we had a fire, they also had a newspaper. And it made a big difference in their ability to recover from the fire, because people knew what they needed and they got donations from far and wide. Now, I think we know about this fire because it's the biggest wildfire Texas has ever experienced. So this is a different order of magnitude that's happening here. So, but again, you know, the national news media will go away, and Canadian is still burning. So there's nobody on the ground to really talk about that. So that is a really sharp example. And, Doug, you were giving me another example before class of something that was.
Oh, there was, I don't remember exactly what it was, but there was a town where nobody was kind of watching the town council. They were doing some things with the books, and, you know, had they been your typical town reporter who was kind of watching things, it probably would have been noticed long before problem had happened.
Yeah.
So I was asking.
Hi, we see the ambassador. Should we all wave at her?
Amy.
How's Florida?
She's muted.
You're
I
on,
hear what she's saying.
you're on mute, but we can tell that you said it was wonderful.
It's wonderful. Thank you.
There you go, send a little sunshine our way. Anyway, so all of those things, you know, got me thinking that, gosh, everybody's now talking about this local news crisis, and now that we're talking about this local news crisis, it's probably really too late to be talking about this local news crisis. You know, it's a little like, like Penny Abernathy has said, you know, it's like cancer, it's a little late. Now we've got it diagnosed at the point where now it's a problem. And everybody's sort of sitting up and paying attention. And I guess the question is, and the reason I think everybody really now is paying attention is because of the election that's coming up, and the fact that we're all kind of watching this polarization that's happening through the country so dramatically. And, I'm going to show you some things from the Medill School of Journalism, a study that they did called the 2023 report of local news. So it's a very good roundup of what's going on around the country. You know, I think as we agreed last week, you know, communities that have newspapers are healthy places. You know, they've got a place where people know what's going on. You've got a place where people, you know, you're able to get engaged with stuff, like you find out what's going on with the local ukulele group. You're able to go give blood, and you're able to go to lectures and before and all this kind of stuff like that. See? But, you know, I mean, all of those things are really important, but all of those things, I think we agreed are being lost, and are being lost at a really rapid rate. And, as we talked about last week, there are big parts of the country that are without the newspaper or in a place at risk of losing the only one that they have. And to be clear, most of these places outside of large cities have weekly papers. They don't have daily papers. So most of the daily papers are clustered around mid-size and large-size cities. So when you get out to the outskirts of Sioux City, you don't get anything. So there are 70 million people. That's a lot of people. So 1/5 of people who live in the United States live in a place that is either has no newspaper or is at risk of losing it. So that's kind of a sobering number of people, especially when you think about the elections coming up and you consider that people who have no other place to get their news, the only place they get their news is from the national news source. And we'll look at what an issue that is a little bit later. I mean, I think you probably understand what an issue that is in terms of the kind of staggering polarization of the information, really. But as we know, we've got a continual loss of newspapers. And somebody asked me today, so you said 75% of journalists are gone. How many does that actually mean? And I think in round numbers, that actually means 43,000 people have lost their jobs. A lot of people. So it's a lot of people. And, you know, the interesting thing is that, of course, weekly papers, as I said, are closing in rural areas. They're actually closing at a higher rate. A lot of that is just because, you know, there isn't a lot of money to help keep these newspapers afloat. There's not a lot of philanthropic funds or donations or any of that kind of stuff like that. The other thing that they're kind of crippled by is many of these news desert places don't have reliable access to internet. So that's a problem. And hopefully that will be corrected in the infrastructure bill that is now addressing a lot of the digital divide. That will be slow. And that, you know, until now, there is a big swath of the country that just does not have information. But the other thing we have to think about is sort of what is the domino effect of this loss. You know, it is on local news, local communities for sure that this loss goes up the chain because that media ecosystem is such that regional papers depend on what happens in their little community papers, and city papers depend on what happens in, you know, the little weekly papers, and the national papers depend on what happens in these little weekly papers. So if there is no weekly paper and there is no information, all of that news is going to get more and more and more nationalized.
I see more often now in national news media, television media, but they're getting story ideas from Instagram or
Yep.
Facebook.
Yep, that's exactly where they've gone.
Frightening.
Well, that's exactly where they've gone because there's so few really local sources anymore. So yeah, that's right. So and I think as I sort of touched on, you know, this sort of sums it up for me, you know, when local news is nowhere, national news is everywhere. You know, it's the only way that you have really to make sense out of the world. You don't have another framework for looking at what's happening in your community. And as this person said, you know, does it really matter that your whatever state legislature or your commissioner or whatever is, you know, feels about the president? I mean, isn't it more important what they think about your issues facing your state? Or facing your community.
Well, they're supposed to represent us.
They are, but no longer. I mean, that litmus test is really becoming, you know, how do you feel about national politics? And that is a thing I attribute to this sort of lack of conversation that we're having at this very local level. You know, this you know, as I said, because the consequences are that, you know, we don't like each other anymore. You know, because we're always told that we don't like each other. And it's, you know, that's kind of and that's what people are hearing over and over and over and over and over. And that's actually documented in this Pew study that was recently of political attitudes of rural communities that have lost their weekly papers have shifted dramatically to the right in political views. And that's evidence partly in split ticket voting, which used to be common, which really doesn't, it's not common anymore in areas where local newspapers close, which means people are just simply voting whatever. They're voting Republican, they're voting Democratic, they're voting Independent, they're voting for people to be here. And another consequence of this is that fewer people run for office, and there's more corruption, and there's higher costs in places that have no newspapers. So these are very real things that I guess people are starting to sort of notice now, you know, maybe. So we're going to get into the second, you know, the sort of bulk of our conversation today with our our friends here, whom I'm going to introduce in a minute, but I wanted to look a little bit ahead of what we can expect, I think, in the newspaper business in the next few years. I think we're all clear that the current model is failing. The subscriptions are dying, people are going online, and the newspapers have had a difficult time finding a way of monetizing that shift. But they all, most of them, unless they're dead already, have a digital site, but people got so used to getting things for free that they've had a very difficult time getting everybody to pay for content. So at the moment, there's a lot of different models that are in development, and we are here. Dave Whalen and Dennis Forty are here today to help us talk through kind of what might be feasible in the future. They approach this in two different ways, the nonprofit and profit, I presume. You made some profits, right?
We couldn't stay in business if we did.
Well, there you go. See, not only did he make profit, but he is an unusual person. He has actually a newspaper that made a profit. So we're going to pick his brain about that because that's an unusual thing in this atmosphere. Because everything depends on finding funding models, and apparently you crack the code, you crack that code. So, it'll be interesting. But as I said, a lot of this stuff that's happening, I think we won't go back to print newspapers. I'm quite sure there'll probably be some hybrid of print and digital. But a lot of the growth, I think, is in online, and I think we'll find out what's happening when we get bandwidth sort of in place and see how that affects the development of this online news business. So let's look at a couple of things before we get into to talking to Dave and to Dennis. There's a couple of things that are coming up that communities have done to address the lack of newspapers in their community. Berkeley Psyche, my guess, is Berkeley. And it's, of course, a co-op because it's Berkeley. Right? And for a donation, and they don't actually say they don't care how much you give them, but for a donation of any kind, you become a member of the co-op. And as a member of the co-op, you have the ability to participate in all of their decisions and have a voice in what gets covered in the paper. But apparently they did well. They raised $1 million in their quest to have their readers become supporters. So whether they can continue doing that year after year is anybody's guess. But that's a model that they have found is starting to work at Berkeley. So this is something that more newspapers are starting to do, and that is that they're combining commercial money with philanthropic funding to try to cover specific issues. This is a bit of a sticky wicket, as they say. I would say, because I think the funding issues, so far, there hasn't been any evidence that the funding issues are tied to specific outcomes and issues, but obviously that's, so if you give someone money, a reporter money, for covering an issue, there's a question about that kind of thing like that. But I think, and I think the problem now is that this is so nascent that there aren't any governing rules really in place of many of the publications. So they don't have rules that say to their reporters, just because you got $1 million from the Scripps Institute, this is hands off. So you go report what you find. So still started to be tested, this sort of combination philanthropic model, I think. And by the way, the investment at this point is very low. It's about $150 million. And there's estimates that they need upwards of about $1.75 billion in order to really fill the need of the gap in the news community. So got a ways to go. I think another very familiar model is the nonprofit model, which kind of public radio model, I guess I call it, for newspapers, right? Which opens you to grants and subscriptions and government funds and donations and kind of more of a mix of things that makes your survival more likely. It does offer a couple of things, improved tax status and stuff. It's difficult for existing newspapers to make that shift. They do, and they have, but it's because all their shareholders have to give up their ownership stakes. They basically say, well, whatever we've had in the paper, whatever we've invested is now gone, and we're now happy shareholders. So we'll see. But, I mean, one of the good things about this nonprofit model is that they are required to be nonpartisan. If they're found to be partisan entities, then they lose their nonprofit status. I believe that's correct. Is that right, Dave? You think something like that?
Something like that.
Depends on where you draw those lines.
Taxes.
Okay. Well, see, I think the last thing that I wanted to talk about was the sort of this collaborative model where it's developing. The papers and different consortiums are able to share resources, reporters, money, time, ideas, knowledge, all this kind of stuff like that in order to cover like bigger and more complex issues. One of the tells, I think, about this collaborative nature of this reporting is that Pulitzer Prize recently has shifted from going to either weekly or daily papers, small papers that have used to do all this enterprise reporting about their communities and things that were kind of surprising, to national issues. They've gone to national issues, they've got national issues and national publications. So, and that's really a pronounced shift in that. I think that tells you something about how the funding and the interest is for these kinds of stories. But, yeah. Well, that brings me to our guest today. I'm very excited that we have with us. I know you're familiar with both of their names, with the Emmys. The envelope goes to, no, but so Dave Whalen, of course, is a very familiar name, I think, to most of you people who live around here. He's the editor and founder of Spy, the Talbot Spy, and Dave Whalen, Dave Sporty's name may not be as familiar, but he started a publication called the Cape Gazette, in Delaware. So you may be familiar with that publication, and I believe Dennis and Dave may have crossed paths with them also. So, but I invited them to come here today because after kind of talking about the loss of local newspapers and what was going on around the country, these guys have kind of approached gaps in their communities in very different ways. And if I could just give a shorthand, I think Dave started sort of a nonprofit education, edutainment kind of publication, fair, and you're kind of doing more coverage of our community, I think, as things become more of a need to, so you're kind of morphing and growing, I think. Right?
Oh, okay.
And I was just going to give a little format. You started both a print publication and managed to grow your online subscription to a degree that's unusual in the business. And you started the Cape Gazette how many years ago? Was that
30 years ago.
30 years ago. So you rode the wave of all the papers going down. I'd really like to hear about how you managed that wave and how you managed to.
I'm trying to figure it out myself.
Very interesting. Well, who wants to go first? You want to talk about how you managed the wave? Because we have talked a lot about how these newspapers have really suffered over the last 20 years. And the fact that you've managed to tell us about the Cape Gazette, tell us about the founding of it, what it kind of the community that it serves.
Would you give them a mic? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure to talk about this. Thanks for shedding light on something that's happening across the country. And like anything, necessity is going to be the mother of invention, and we're always evolving. So we'll just see what the next chapters hold, and we are starting to see them anyway with publications like Dave's Spies, publication, and all that sort of thing. I was just thinking a little bit, they're talking about the collaborative deal and all these different news organizations sharing their news and all that. Well, I had a sick feeling this week. I've been working on this oyster article for a while, and then I pick up the Star Democrat on Sunday, and there's the lead headline, Mounts introduces oyster legislation. I've been working on this story for about 3 or 4 weeks. I just got this sick feeling in my stomach, and you know why? Because the name of the business is still Scoop. And you don't like to get scooped, it makes you ill. Anyway, I'm working on redeeming that.
Come on, you're a little too slow. You gotta speed up. You're right.
You want me to speak faster?
No, I want you to speed up your story.
Subject matter. Okay.
No,
Just keep it a story.
Sorry.
Okay. No, that's the story, because in order, all of a sudden, you're telling people who have been competing with each other for decades and centuries to get the story first
Right.
and beat everybody, because that's the way they were going to get their readers. And it all goes together. But if you've got readers, then you've got something to offer to advertisers. And this is really, in a nutshell, why the Cape Gazette was successful over 30 years, because we understood, number one, that the community really wanted a newspaper. We were over on the coast of Delaware. It was a very sophisticated audience. It was a very vibrant economic community. You had retirees, you had vacationers, you had all this mixture of people that made it a very strong market. And we grew up with newspapers like the Star Democrat, Kent County News, where I grew up in Chestertown. All these little county seat towns had their newspapers, and they kept people apprised of what was going on. And so we understood that the people really wanted their news, and that if we could get the readers, we could get the advertisers, because it's eyeballs on the page, on ads. It's really no different. I know Dave has the same thing with the spies. Yes,
Did you have was there a paper already in existence in Lewes?
there were two other newspapers.
So how did you determine your niche? How did you decide that was, they needed a third?
Well, somebody asked me one day, they said, Dennis, we already have two newspapers. Do you think there's room for yours? I said, I don't know if there's room for three newspapers, but there is room for this one. So anyway, we always had a good idea that we were going to put out a quality publication where one of our watchwords was, there's a couple of them, content is king. Content is king. We had no syndicated news, none whatsoever. We were completely local newspaper. And the other watchword we had was, give them something they can't get anywhere else. So they had to come to us. And I also said, I want to be a paid newspaper because I just feel like it has to be something that people are willing to plunk down some money to get. If I'm not putting out a product that's not worth paying for, then I didn't want to do that. But at any rate, we worked hard on it. We tried to focus on quality. We had quality photographers. We had quality reporters. We rapidly developed an audience. We had a really vibrant real estate market there with properties changing hands all the time. So that worked out well. And we had thousands and thousands of readers on a regular basis who wanted to know what was going on. And after a while, the advertisers started to compete for space in the newspaper because they didn't want to be left out.
What?
And that, were you affected by the shift to the internet and Craigslist?
Well, yeah, we were affected, but one thing we did was kind of a stroke of dumb luck, I think, early on. We decided we were going to give away classified ads. And these were going to be any ad up to 25 words, help wanted, because we wanted to help the businesses get their people in and all that sort of stuff. And what we determined was that there's great readership in classified ads. And that, number one, these people that place the ads were going to read the ads. And if people were looking for what they wanted to have, were going to read the ads. So it was another readership item. We also placed a great premium on obituaries because, as far as we were concerned, obituaries were free feature stories. Every one of them is a feature story on their neighbors, friends, and things like that. So anyway, we worked very hard at it. We had lots and lots of readers. The paper's still going strong. The subscription base continues to grow. The internet activity continues to grow. And Dave knows this. One of the great things about the internet was when we went digital, and we did it very, very early on because we saw what was happening. When you put a story up, you can go right into all your data statistics and see how many people have gone in to read that story. So it really gave us an idea of what stories were sort of resonating with the readers, and we could focus in those areas. We didn't want to dip to what they call clickbait. That's where you're doing something to make people click on it. I mean, I found early on in a weekly column, anytime I used the word mysterious in a headline, I would get at least 300 or 400 extra readers. So I had a lot of mysteries in my columns. The mysterious thing is trying to find something interesting in this column this week. But I want to say this too. Over on the coast of Delaware, there is kind of like the opposite of a news desert. It's more like a news oasis. The Cape Gazette is in the Lewis Rehoboth area. Down the coast is the Coastal Point, which is in the Bethany Beach area. Now, one thing you're going to see in common here, these are high growth areas. And then further down in Ocean City, another friend of mine, a Denton native named Stuart Dobson, he has a newspaper called the Ocean City Today. And these are all very strong local weekly newspapers that focus entirely on their local communities and names and faces. And we knew that names and faces would sell newspapers and all that sort of thing. It's a very organic enterprise, and one which I always call the quintessential American enterprise, because it's so critical for our democracy. Democracy depends on informed citizenry to make good decisions for the good of the whole society, whatever they may be. And the other thing about it was we were a business. We had to be responsive to our readers. We had to be fair, because if we weren't, we had to be balanced. We were going to piss off our advertisers, and they were going to yank their ads. They were only threatening to do it anyway. But they would do that. So to me, it was an enterprise. It was based on competition and getting better because of it, and doing good in a community, and all that sort of thing. The internet just provided us a whole nother opportunity to develop readers and cross-market back and forth between the two of
Just
us.
for a second.
No, I'm not going to let you. I have a lot more to say. You yanked me, let it be known.
He needs to wear the princess. We're gonna come back with questions. I feel like the moderator. Think about what questions you want to ask. But I wanted Dave to sort of give us a little background on Talbot Spy, how we got started with that.
Well, it's quite a different story. You know, I was actually a nonprofit executive for 30 years. I wasn't in the news business. But so this is somewhat of a second life for me. So I started this not really with the ambition of starting a business. I really thought that the best thing to do was to focus on the things that I was interested in, which was basically public affairs. So think C-SPAN, the kind of non-biased news coverage. And then the other things that I love, which is art and culture, all the subcategories of that. And I started this at the right time, at the right place, because the internet was available. I started this in 2009. It was the interesting intersection between the internet, of course, but also the use of multimedia. Another thing that I've been interested in from the get-go. And so my expectations, actually I started the Spy in Chestertown, and I named it, for the record, for the local newspaper, which started in 1793. So it was kind of an inside joke about this wonderful story that could only be Chestertown's. What I don't tell people is they went out of business about 2 years later. But it was primarily an experiment of whether or not a community would find this relevant, which is my word. And it turned out it did. I mean, it was this community had been served by one weekly newspaper, the Kent County News. This was at a time when Kent County in particular was under threat of development. And at the end of the day, what I thought that the community needed was something that had an educational mission that could explain the challenges that they face. And 2 years later, given this interesting experiment, I came to Talbot County and used the same template. And that set me into a different journey altogether, because I eventually moved to Easton. But it was again, it was the same thing. There was a hunger for local news and to be relevant in terms of what you cover in terms of local government or healthcare. And so that was an ingredient. And, as we kind of grown, we started the opposite way. We had corporate sponsors before we actually had reader donations. And thank goodness, I became an official nonprofit in 2013. I'm a fund at the Inland Shore Community Foundation. And it's been amazing to see the transition between basing this on the goodwill of sponsors, advertisers, and now really seeing the readership supporting the enterprise has just been phenomenal. So, one of the things that I was interested in pointing out as I was watching your presentation is there is a lot of emphasis on local community news. But I think sometimes we forget that local news could actually mean the entire metropolitan Baltimore area.
For sure.
And so, I'm really in the extremely local news business, which makes it even harder in many ways. But, I every year, I have to raise enough money to keep this thing going. We did start a Cambridge Spy 2 years ago. And just about 6 months ago, we started the Centerville Spy. So we now have a unique reader.
Spying on us all over the place.
I know, every community needs a spy. But I think it's again, it's a tool for citizenship. It's also a vehicle to celebrate this incredible culture we have here. And because of the tools like multimedia, strong sense that it has a future. The other point I wanted to make was that we are not the newspaper of record, and that makes a big deal. I had no aspirations to be the newspaper of record. I did not compete. I don't think I compete with the Star Democrat. But whether or not this model could be used for a newspaper of record, and that.
Can you just elaborate on that a little bit, on what that means not to be a newspaper of record? I mean, who writes your content?
Well, usually the newspaper record is quite, not unofficial mandate to cover local government, sports, crime,
Obituaries.
legal notices, in the back of the day, classifieds. And so it takes on a whole new level of responsibility. That's why I feel like a lot of these legacy newspapers are at risk because they have the burden of producing physically a newspaper, distributing it, and also competing against entities that don't need them.
Right, maybe Dennis would like to take that it's like debate.
I don't think it's any kind of a debate. I think that it's a newspaper of record, of course, is like Dave said, is covering the county government. A lot of newspapers really started off as county seat newspapers because they were associated with the courthouse. They would cover the government news, cover the Board of Education, and would publish the public notices. And if you'll notice in the Star Democrat, those of you who read the Star Democrat, they publish quite a few public notices in the back, and they'll often use unused space back there to say, why is this so important? How are you going to find these public notices about these meetings that government entities are holding out kind of stuff if we don't do this? And there is a constant fight, the Maryland, Delaware, DC Press Association. And I think, have you joined the MDDC, Dave?
No.
But I think they have a category now for nonprofits as well. But the Maryland, Delaware, and the Public Record, somebody knew that newspaper right out of Baltimore?
Daily Record. You mean the Daily?
The Daily Record, right. Any rate, there's this constant fight because local governments, in their attempts to try to cut expenses and all that, always take a look at the amount of money they're spending on publishing notices, public notices in newspapers, which it's often mandated in the law that these things have to be published because that's the whole idea, let the public know what's going on. So, anyway, that's the newspaper of public record. But but it does take on a great responsibility. But if you're in the right market, and when I worked at Star Democrat back in 1974, so that's right. At a time when the Star Democrat was running 70, 80, 90 pages on a weekly basis, and it was a thriving local newspaper. Had all the local sports, covered all the local governments, covered the county government, covered the town governments, covered the school board and all that. And its editor, who I'm proud to say was my mentor, lives right here in Easton, Denise Perry, maybe some of you know Denise. And she was a great community newspaper editor. She knew her community, knew what the community wanted. And again, it's just organic. There's like that one of those things that you showed up there. It's kind of a mirror. It's the community talking to itself. And I think that's what one of the great fears is as we start to lose these publications, is there's not as much dialogue within communities. Well, it has to start someplace.
Right.
So it often starts by reading an article, whether it's in Spy or in one of the newspapers, something like that. So, hey, did you read about that? Did you read about, what do you think about that? And then that's all becomes part of that public discourse, the kind of town square mentality where people got together to discuss the issues in a community.
Anyone have a question, please? Hello. Amanda, yes.
The Star
I'm
Democrat,
gonna give you the mic because
It's
it's
got-
hard for everybody.
I've lived here for 12, 13 years now. And the Star Democrat seems like it's on its last legs. And I am just appalled that it's gone downhill so fast. Seems to me it probably got hit really hard with the recession. Here was 2008, 9, 10, 11. And the loss of classified ads, and then people feeling they could get their news from Facebook. But I'm really worried that the Star Dem is on. I mean, when I read, a lot of the articles right now to me are nothing but PR statements.
That's correct, you're reading it correctly.
And I wish they wouldn't do that because it makes you not want to read the newspaper. You know, you read a couple lines, this is a PR statement, I don't want to read that. The letters to the editor part is almost, I don't know whether it's the print, the cost of the print. They don't seem to have a dedicated reporter anymore for some of the local meetings, the county. I just wondered, does anybody know what's going on there and whether,
I had a conversation with one of their reporters before I had for this class, and you know, they were bought by a large, you know, I don't know if you describe it as an investment group. They describe themselves as Adams Publishing Group. They're one of the third largest newspapers in the country. You know, they're running a business, but the business is a very difficult model because they, as you pointed out, during the pandemic, they lost a lot of money on advertising. So 10 years ago, the reporter told me that they had 8 editors, they had 10 reporters, they had 5 sports reporters, they had photographers, they had a whole suite of people who were covering 5 counties, right? 5 counties. They have 3 reporters, they have no sports reporters, they have no photographers. Everybody works on a freelance basis, covering 5 counties. So they can't do it. They can't do it. So they got a lot of stuff that's contributed, which is how they describe their PR.
I wanted to point out in terms of Dennis's model, it might creep back to the Star Democrat challenges. And Dennis lived in that community. You both were very actively involved in that community. You saw them at the grocery store. And I think, you know, the Star Democrat was no different 30, 40 years ago. There was a local orientation that felt authentic.
And I just want to amplify that again. Denise Perry lived right here in Easton all her life. She knew the town inside and out. Her father, Bill Perry, was one of the founders of the Waterfowl Festival. Again, these are people that were integrally involved in their community. And I saw one of the statements up there is that newspapers should feel no embarrassment or guilt or whatever for loving their communities. And they do. I mean, that should come through and through. And editorially and things, and don't be afraid to throw out opinions, but always on the basis of, we're pointing these things out because we always call them in our news meetings, wobbles. What are the wobbles that we see this week in the community that we should address? If we can say something editorial, it might move that wobble a little bit more toward balance. We would do that, but I think that, and Becky brought it out last week, that once these newspapers get bought up by these large firms, they kind of lose their local heart. And it can be a very gratifying business to be involved in. It's a lot of work, but what business isn't a lot of work? And if you do it right and you got a good community, this Talbot is a prosperous retail community. And you just have to develop that.
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, anybody? So I do have a question because one of the things that we're losing, Dennis, is sort of involves you and you also, but we're losing journalists and we're losing professionalism. So, and not to, I mean, Dave's model is different because it's not, there are many fine writers who write for the Talbot Spy, but journalism is not the primary focus or emphasis. Can you talk a little bit about what we lose when we lose those people, those jobs?
Well, when you said use the term professional, you're losing professional journalists who know the importance of who, what, when, where, how, and why, and understand what it is to go in and listen to a meeting and try to find the important information and how to present it in a fairly concise and informative fashion that'll be interesting to readers. And there are, and Dave, you're familiar with some of these things, and again, they came up on some of the things that you're talking about. Even with the Cape Gazette was starting to get some support money from outfits like Google that wanted to support local readership, because there are a lot of aggregators out there also that basically steal content and put it up on their sites and say, oh, this is it, this is it, this is it. And I think the problem with all that is that you are losing professional people, but Maryland, Delaware, DC Press Association offers 3 or 4 paid internships a year to newspapers throughout the Maryland, Delaware, DC area to focus on certain aspects of reporting. And Dave, who's on the St. Michael's Commission and is a professional newsman in his own right, and Sarah, we've talked about this from time to time of what could we do to help set up a local foundation that might help fund a particular reporting position. That we would say, we want to help fund a position that will cover whatever thing that we think needs to be covered. Or come up with a way that we could buy a page once a week in the Star Democrat and have certain reports on there of stuff that we're interested in.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that on the collaboration basis, I have been talking to the Star Democrat as well as our new NPR station, WHCP, and others to work through this issue. It's complicated when you're talking about different mediums and different cultures. But I think there's an interesting audience for this at this point. And I think the example was, I think we would have done better if we had formed a collaborative association during COVID, for example. That the ability and the capacity to kind of, feed that news responsibly would have been really hopeful. So I'm somewhat optimistic.
Well, what do you have to say about it?
Karen?
So are you saying that the Star Dem has a possibility of returning to brightness?
Through its association?
I just feel so sympathetic
Yeah.
to anybody in this legacy news business. I think that because that is an exception to the rule. It just will, the snooze doesn't will grow. But I do feel like the demand for return on investment is severe. And I think that until that works itself out, which could be a hybrid of nonprofit and profit, I think it's going to be tough going. And I just feel like we're feeling like at some point, Chesapeake Publishing will just simply stop many of these satellite newspapers they have. I'm just waiting for that to happen.
Suzanne?
Is anybody looking into getting payment from these aggregators online that are taking content from print and just stealing it basically and not paying it? Is there any kind of movement, action, lawsuits, anything like that?
Answer is yes to all those. But I don't know the specific.
Is that Newsbreak?
Yeah.
It's called News?
One round called Newsbreak.
I don't know, but it gives me an opportunity to plug a wonderful nonprofit state newspaper that everybody should be reading. That's Maryland Matters. It is a phenomenal resource. And there's been a lot of other models, particularly in Texas, where a statewide public policy newspaper is successful, but we print them at their permission every day.
I've got really quite, anyway, on the business model, that if you were able to successfully navigate, it just seems to me other papers can do this. I mean, look at the New York Times and the Washington Post. I used to get them in print. I just now sit there and read them on my phone. That was, oh my God, that was difficult, but I can do it. And they know how to kind of get new readers. I know the Post made it. The New York Times definitely knows how to get new readers with, $4 a month for the first year, and they've got your credit card. So, I mean, I just think there are a lot of business models that will work if you can get savvy people on your staff to do it. But, and then my second question is it true, because I read that some newspapers were actually profitable, but then were taken over by these larger conglomerates, even though they were profitable. So why did that happen? I mean, how did, I'd like to know the story behind that.
Hedge funds.
Yeah.
Well, I thought maybe you were going to talk about hedge funds.
Well, that's talk about it.
Well, that's a higher end sort of stuff that.
I think what we've seen is that hedge funds have gone into, have bought up local newspapers, even profitable ones, like we're talking about, and then they cut the staff, they cut the operating budget down to a bare minimum, and then sell the real estate. So, for instance, the Philadelphia Inquirer once occupied a 25-story, beautiful white building in downtown Philadelphia, tower of journalism and excellence, and they were eventually bought by one of these hedge funds. They're now in the second floor of what used to be the Strawbridge and Clothier department store in downtown Philadelphia. The entire Inquirer staff is there. They closed their printing plant out in Upper Merion, and because the hedge fund wanted to sell off that property, so they just gutted the newspaper, sold off all the assets, and it's happening in cities and towns all across America, not just in Philadelphia. It's a profit motivation that it's only dollars the bottom line, not informing the public. But then again, you look at newspapers from the very beginning, it was always about making a buck.
Oh, for sure.
Not about informing the public, it's about getting the public to buy the paper. And that's where yellow journalism, the whole history of the story.
So that sort of begs the question, because it always has been a profit model.
I just want to give one more example. Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post. They've been laying off reporters at the Post steadily. and their content is going downhill.
Yeah.
And they're sort of complaining that they're not making any money. I don't know. I'd like to know really, why did he buy it? Was it to make money or was it to, I thought it was sort of a public service. I thought he was doing it because he's the good guy. It's going to take over the post.
You know, I think that example begs the question at whether newspapers should become nonprofits, like utilities. You know, are they important to us as a community? Should they be government funded? Should they be, you know, funded on a nonprofit model or something, you know, because the profit model did not work out. Although I worked for Dennis. Dennis, you're gonna tell us some magic.
It's a lot of work, and you've got to do the right thing. And I was told this guy was going to start this newspaper. He was part of the whole Herald Tribune and whatever the name of the paper is over in France, the American paper over there. And he said, his name was Collinsworth. He said, oh, I understand you're going to start this newspaper, good for you, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, I know we got to do this, I got to do this, I got to do this. He said, you got to do this too. And I said, well, you know, which thing do I need to do first? He said, no, you've got to do all of them at the same time. I think that it was Kurt Vonnegut coined the word, the chronosyncratic infundibulum, everything all at once at the same time. But it is work, and I think that, I think there's a future, I really do. Remember the term, the fourth estate? And you say, you know, when you have the government now starts, you ever heard of Pravda?
Sure.
You know, when the government is the one that puts out the newspaper, then who do you think is going to control the agenda for the news cycle and all that? So the independent press is really the key to helping this democracy function well. The watchdog, the press as a watchdog is critical, but it has to be done in an entertaining fashion and engaging fashion so that people want to get it and read it and see the latest stuff. They just don't want skullduggery and yellow journalism. They want good reporting that informs their life, but it's got to be done in an entertaining way. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Then there's the other side of it. Murdoch owning how much? Where? I mean, Australia, they only get their news from him.
Yeah.
Okay? Sky News, all these sort of places. I mean, right, it's great that there are people that are out there, you know, trying to do. But then there's over control of it, where the only thing you hear is what they want you to hear, but there is no competition. And in fact, their competition is themselves, which I find just completely hysterical. You know, they'll produce two newspapers, and both newspapers are owned by the same person. Does anybody think that might be a possible problem? You know, that's one thing. The other thing, though, which I find really interesting, I also read the Times. Okay, they used to be, you know, you'd get the brick and you read it all day. Okay, I find reading it online actually really a nice experience because there's links that I can go look at background information. It's really well done. Whether you agree with their philosophy or don't agree with their philosophy, you can always go from one place to another and see where it came from. Sometimes it's their article, sometimes it isn't their articles. It's rather interesting. I just really enjoy looking, besides the fact that if I don't understand a word, I can look it up. It's what it actually means. But it is really nice, you know, to do that as opposed to having the paper itself. You know, I think they do an interesting job well, the way they organize themselves for it.
I have 4 granddaughters, ages like 14 up to 22, high school, college. I don't think any one of those girls has ever voluntarily picked up a newspaper, nor do I ever expect them to do so. I don't think their friends at all ever pick up a newspaper. They literally don't care. That's the really scary part of it. So, I mean, we can talk all we want, but do we have an audience?
Yeah, next generation, right?
And I think the answer is maybe not. I mean, I thought about getting them a newspaper, and I talked to my son and my daughter. They said, Dad, you're wasting your time.
It's like a newspaper, what's that?
They have Facebook
And they live in Boston.
or Instagram. Yeah, Instagram tells you everything. If you want to know.
I'm the eternal optimist. And I think that newspapers were once obviously the dominant news source, and not really for a long period of time in history. If you really take it, all the way from the printing press up to when they were just purely political vehicles for different parties that would just put out these, what they call them? Broadsides, that sort of stuff. But there was a period of time when they were the dominant. You had your H.L. Menckens of the world that were, and the Baltimore Sun had bureaus in Tokyo and in China and all over the world. They were the dominant, but it was a relatively short period of time of that dominance. And I think now they're settling back into sort of a niche sort of a deal. Well, the nice thing about it is, and I think we talked about this last week a little bit, it's an edited package of news. That newspaper is. And even for a local community, like the Star Democrat, and I think that put in the right hands, the Star Democrat could be a very profitable newspaper and a much larger force in this community than it is now, but not like it once was. Because this is a good market, and you've got the fundamentals here to make it all work. But I think that, and it's still that edited packet news, give them something they can't get everywhere else. I don't need to get the comics in the Star Democrat. I don't need the national sports in the Star Democrat. I don't need this. What I do want is the local letters to the editor. I want the obituaries. I want the local high school sports. I want to know what's going on at the Board of Education, the Talbot County Council, the town councils, and those sorts of things. And there's interesting issues. Dave, you know it, down at your level, at St. Michael's level, you're seeing issues that are going to bubble up to national status. And I'm sure you. Dave could do an article, have articles done on the dog park, which are, everybody's interested in dogs and all over the country. And you'll see it right there in St. Michael's. I don't know if you want to talk about that. But no, not that in particular, but those things do bubble up at the local level and eventually find their way up to national prominence.
Ironically, I just came from a budget meeting in which dog excrement came up. Topic of discussions. Yeah, I mean, local communities are a mirror of the nation as a whole. I mean, the same things that affect us at the local level are affecting people in communities all over America. But, like Jim said at the last session, that, people have retreated to their own silos, and to a great degree, it's because they don't have the exposure of a local newspaper form like letters to the editor, where you can sound out ideas and issues and do it in a kind of responsible, reasoned sort of way. Now we have social media where things erupt into a bonfire at the slightest spark. And, you can say one thing about social media, that some people like it because it represents the democratization of news dissemination. Whereas you were a gatekeeper, Dave was a gatekeeper, you decide what goes in the paper, Dave decides what goes into the spine. But people decide what goes on Facebook and Twitter or X or whatever it is now. And you have people like Elon Musk, who's got turned from a very kind of left-wing bent to a very libertarian bent. And, that censorship should be done away with, that people should have a free and open forum. So I think the challenge is finding a balance at a local level where you have outlets like something online, something in print that maybe collaborate at times, that people can trust to be neutral on most everything and not trying to get clicks on their website. And we've seen the failure of a lot of models, media models, that are dependent on clickbait. They're going under pretty quickly, just asking people advice.
And I think these models that we're talking about, I'll just be brief. I don't know if you all ever read articles online from The Guardian. And do you see at the bottom of the articles, we are not supported by any big corporations. We depend on you to help us with this. Wikipedia, which I have relied on for years, is another one that's based on public donations. But the important thing about what I like about Wikipedia is you go through and you read these articles, but again, like what you're talking about, the sources are there. You can go down to the lower level and see all the different sources that this came from. So there's a level of integrity there and validity that is important. And I think that all that together is part of what we're going to see in the future. And I think at this local level, whether it's the Spy or the Star Democrat, the Star Democrat could do a site of record and get rid of the printing costs and the distribution costs. This is what weighs these organizations down. It's very, very expensive to produce newspapers. And, but having the internet gets rid of that cost. But if you start to dedicate yourself, I mean, I know people that say, okay, it's Friday, I think this is the day I get to watch From Fuller. People are creatures of habit. They like to see these things, and whether it's in the paper or whether it's on the digital edition of the New York Times or whatever, they know what day certain columnists are there. That can be done at the local level also, and be a regular cover of St. Michael's Commissioners and the Talbot County, all these sorts of things, and do a credible job.
Yeah.
I think, as I said, I'm a turtle.
I think one of the challenges, when I look at this in my head is that somehow this has turned into a real table.
I like the part where you're holding a microphone and you've got a microphone.
And I have a mic.
You can drop the mic.
That's why it's too much, MC Hammer. All right, well, where was I going with that? The future of, oh gosh, no, I completely forgot where it was going. I know I was going to ask about, because I think that the impact of right now of the lack of news coverage is really hitting sort of the central part of the country, places that are far away from big cities and that don't have this broadband internet coverage and the ability to do it. I'd like to just think a minute, like go around the room. And yeah, go ahead.
One kind of question I had to the part, I like to read online for the reason you do, because of the links, and also I'm a terrible vocabulary, so I can look at what the word mean. But I prefer to read the paper because I scan every headline, and I get to see things that I wouldn't normally see in my normal feed, or perspectives I wouldn't normally read. And I'm nervous that what I do online starts to focus on just things I want, which doesn't necessarily. So I haven't seen online where I have the comfort. I guess the Spy generally has a pretty consistent format, so I can find things in general. But that's the one thing that I think I lose.
You are right. Because,
Yeah.
because just to take the Times, for example. So the Times online, you get the front page, then it's divided up into sections.
Right.
And where like you had the time just kind of like going, and you find something. Now I find myself, okay, I'm from New York. So I'll read the front page and then I'll go to the New York section because I want to see what's going on. It's like, oh, wait a minute, I wonder what's going on in this section. But you have to, it's like you have to put, it's like a push system, okay?
Right.
Where news isn't, it isn't pushed to you, you have to pull it. You have to come along and say, oh, look, I want to see what's, for example, in the arts. So I'll go to the arts section. I want to see. But if you don't do that, you're never going to see it because you're not turning a page. You're totally right. In fact, when I was reading the paper on Sunday, it was like the first thing that I was thinking, like, my God, like if I don't go to this section, I'm never going to see.
Exactly. I like having
somebody might be interesting.
Right. I like having somebody kind of curate the whole thing because I go through page by page and I look at every headline, and even some of the ads are useful to me too. So when I travel, I do get the Washington Post, and they do have it where you can read the piece. But it's, small and you gotta look at it, so it's not as convenient. But that's the one thing that I worry about. If we can solve that problem, I'd be more comfortable with the online piece.
I'd be interested in asking Dave, just Dave, what sort of trends do you see by doing this by publication and seeing these different elements start to arise and trends that you see that roll through because of your format? Any particular thing?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it is readership, right? So we're getting about 1 million unique visitors a year. And that's defined as coming to the site once. If you come twice, you're still one unique visitor. And our content goes to about 5 million. We're a media market of 175,000. So the fact that we've been able to have that kind of impact gives me optimism that people want to be engaged. They, you know, I think that the other thing, going back to your comment, I mean, if I was in the news business, I couldn't make it because some of the stuff that I put out, you know, 100 people look at. I mean, it's not like you have this phenomenal body, but you have a public responsibility to get it out there. And so I feel like that is the other trend when I look at sponsors, advertisers, the largest ones, let's say banks, that's all they want to look at is the hit rate. I can't compete. So I have to say that, you know, we have brought, you know, public support. And so it's a real challenge.
Dave, is, you know, running a paper online, you may have already addressed this, I missed it, but running a paper online is not cheap.
No.
You still have to pay hefty fees for the web servicing and all that, right?
Yeah, I would say just on the software, hardware front, somewhere in the area of 15,000 a year. But it's
That's a lot cheaper than paper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, really, no one makes any salary at the SPY. Those who are supported get stipends. I would say 70% of our writers are volunteers. Some of them happen to be ace reporters. But we depend on the goodwill of a community, and you all know this more than anybody. This community is so rich. We have people who came from news that are, you know, focused on community activity, and so we're blessed on that front too.
Yeah, definitely an anomaly.
The community is also blessed with huge financial wealth.
Right.
I, you know, wouldn't want to leave this meeting without considering the idea of, could there potentially be some leadership that would emerge that could talk to the Adams hedge fund people and try and buy what started out and bring it back to what it was and what it could be.
Adams will not sell.
Won't sell it because
That's all right.
It's part of, because it's part of, you know, 13 papers.
Yeah.
So it's like they can't just carve it out.
Yeah.
But it's, I know a lot of people have tried to talk to them about that.
I would, just,
I know, it does seem like there's an opportunity. Go ahead and.
So, 20 and 30-year-olds, you know, we've got a bias here about paper and turning pages, but 20 and 30-year-olds are getting virtually all their news from TikTok, you know, short, snappy videos. And so, Dave and Dennis, are you strategizing about that? How that's going to affect what you're doing 5 years, 10 years down the road?
So Dave, are you asking Dave or you probably?
Both.
Oh, yeah. So, how are you doing with TikTok? You got your dance going?
Well, we haven't done TikTok. We do Twitter or X as it's called now. Keep in mind our demographic. We're an older community. We are probably one of the oldest communities in the state of Maryland. And so I think my sense of I have to reach younger people is just not going to be on the top of my list. But I do feel like even in that 30-second or 5-second, you know, you can get some news out. You know, don't necessarily discount all social media, but it's troubling.
It's interesting that the Times, when you, on the top of each one of their articles, they tell you how long it will take you to read.
Yes.
Which I thought was, it's like 5-minute reading.
Very popular.
Yeah.
I've been tempted to do that. We do that with our videos.
By the way, it doesn't take 5 minutes to read it.
Okay.
You kind of suck you into this, like you're at the 15-minute mark going, was this a 5-minute reading?
One thing that we didn't mention, which I think maybe could be a subject down the road, is the use of artificial intelligence.
Oh, I would like you to talk about that, because you use a little bit of that, don't you?
Let's say we do a little bit.
Yes.
I don't know how many people went through that experience maybe a year ago where you saw what ChatGPT could do, but it was this unbelievable moment for me. It's scary, but it's also could be very powerful.
So replace the rest of the journalists, will it?
What's that?
Will it replace the rest of the journalists?
Well, I'll give you an example of how maybe over time we could use it as a spy. We're still using it to a certain degree. You know that these county and town meetings last forever. They are 3.5 hours. In a typical model, you would send a reporter there. And I would say that 50% of the time, there's no news. There's just literally, there's legislative things. And so, you're not getting that kind of result. What I've been able to do, Queen Anne's County, when I started the Centervilles, we're doing this a lot with Queen Anne's County, is I'm taking those 3.5-hour meetings, getting a transcription, and feeding it into ChatGPT. And by that, it summarizes that 3.5-hour meeting into sections that I understand and can take action on if need be. And usually that results in taking clips from the meeting of the areas that I'm interested in and pushing it out. And, it's increasingly more accurate. What's more interesting as a gatekeeper, I think that I'm learning a hell of a lot. But I'm learning it at a speed that would not have been possible without artificial intelligence.
On your TikTok point, we did a redesign of our newspaper about 14 years ago, and there was a guy named Mario Garcia. And Mario is one of the world's great newspaper designers. And he came in and told us, he said, now look, do not discount the allure of national entertainment sort of things that you can massage for your newspaper and get great play on those stories. For example, we were down at Rehoboth Beach. Anytime somebody would come to town, whether it was Joe Biden or a celebrity or a big basketball player or somebody down at the Bottle Court was playing or something like that. If we would take that story and pull off some sort of a national aspect of it, I think that when Brett Kavanaugh was being vetted for the Supreme Court position, everybody was doing stories about how he used to go to the Bottle Court down in Dewey Beach and was carousing and doing all this kind of stuff that young people just never, ever, ever did. Because they couldn't, because they had to be saintly, to make it all the way up to the higher ranks. But he just stressed to us, do not underestimate how interested young people in particular are in that kind of a nationalization of your news at the local level. And I think that, that really worked for our purposes too. And another thing that we did was on our front page, I would often see how many different stories are available on that front page for somebody, if that sits there in that honor box. I wanted to have at least 13 different stories on that front page that would bring readers inside the newspaper and want them to plug their 50 cents or $1 into that box to get that there. As I said, you have to work so many different angles.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah.
The last point I want to make is on the Bay Weekly. Are you familiar with the Bay Weekly, the Bay Journal?
Yeah,
It's a good paper. and it comes out monthly, and it's subsidized and all that sort of thing. And it makes all of its articles, you'll see its articles show up in the Star Democrat and in the Spy, picks them up also. So that's part of that collaboration thing that's going on.
Zach, if you guys were betting, which model would you bet on for the future of the news business? Everybody raise their hands, nonprofits, everything for profit.
Is that an investment?
Over here.
Is that how we're thinking about it?
Yeah, I don't know, I'm curious how you see it.
Do you still give student, or do they still give student subscriptions?
Sure.
It's like when kids would go to college or go away to school, they had a 9-month subscription. So they could, it's like a letter from home.
Sure, that's a great idea.
Yeah, and when my kids would get it, the other kids in the dorms would be like, wow, this is so cool, we don't have a paper like this in our town. They thought it was hot, really unusual.
Yeah.
That was a good thing.
I'm curious what you think the lesson learned from your experience with the print paper would be to share with our local print paper. It seems like what I'm hearing you say is the antithesis that they're not very in tune to what people are wanting. Now, maybe that will change, but right now, they don't people pick it up 3 building charters.
Hyperlocal. Again, that whole thing of content is king. Why are you going to give stories that they can read 25 different outlets? Give them stories they can't get anywhere.
Yeah, they're even doing national news now.
Yes, they do a lot of national news.
Yeah.
I did a count, well, every Sunday I do a count because that's the big paper, the Star Democrat. So I count the number of stories that are contributed by the local reporters and local issues, the number that came from the Associated Press and outside, and the number that were pure press releases. Which one do you think is the biggest number?
Pure press releases.
It was 4 or 5 articles by the local reporters, and most of them are doing 2 articles a week for the Sunday edition. There's about 4 or 5 Associated Press articles, and then there's 9 or 10 press releases, at least now they're putting, contributing to the byline. They used to not have any bylines at all.
But really, the financial model for that is still built on subscriptions and it's built on advertising. Most of the advertising is
It's an advertising circular these days.
And it's really hard to keep that going. I think they've carved their staff.
have very little real estate advertisement in that paper, do they?
I don't see much.
Well, Zillow took care of that.
No, Dennis, I mean, the Cape Gazette has
That's what I don't
pages,
understand,
pages.
is how you kept all that when everything went online. I don't get it. It's like, just your magic charm.
Well, again, you have to work so many, it's cultivating. You've got to cultivate. We would take 25 newspapers every week to every real estate office in that community. And they had that newspaper and they were all reading and they were seeing what their competitors were doing and who their listings were doing. And it just kind of built on itself, And one time, this guy was in Rotary Club, Jack Riddle. He said, I said, he was saying, do you know why so many people are advertising your paper? I said, well, I think it's because of the newspaper. He said, no, they're afraid not to. Because also we were very vigorous with our editorial stances. And they figured that if they didn't advertise, there was, if they were, at least if they were a regular advertiser, I might be a little more gentle on it, but I would never, I would pull punches, but I wouldn't pull them completely. I was always trying to be fair. That was the main thing. They said they're afraid not to, Dennis. They're afraid what you're going to say if they don't. All right, it's working. I've got to pay the bills, folks.
So you're seeing some expansion, I think, Talbot's by with your relationship with Star Dem and trying to go into some little niches.
Yeah, we've got a significant primary coming up in the Republican Party, actually. And there's going to be trying to arrange a town hall that we can all come.
Great.
But it takes a while. I mean, even if there's cooperation, we're still trying to work out what this means.
But you don't see that as sort of a shift to, I wouldn't say change, but a shift in your mission to covering more of government and.
Oh, no, we've been covering government from day one. It's just the style in which we do it. And I think, again, it's just, it takes a lot of time to cover these things.
I used to sit in interminable meetings for little town council meetings all over Philadelphia. They were torture.
Oh, right.
And that's where the love of the community comes in. Because a lot of people that are in this business are in it for the love of being in the business and being part of the game and being involved, because it does get into your blood. And I hope everybody realizes how fortunate we are that Dave is doing what he's doing with this spy. You know, he updates that edition every day, 7 days a week. I am totally just amazed and awed, and I tell him this frequently. I'm just, it's pretty doggone amazing.
I love this community.
Yeah, exactly.
I love this community. So every one of them is different.
Yeah.
Cambridge is going through so much struggle. So to have that counterpoint to what we take for granted sometimes in television, it's unbelievable.
The biggest news out of Cambridge is, what's the, Jersey Mike? Jersey Mike opened up.
Oh, I know.
Franchise sub shop.
What is it? It's
The franchise sub shop.
What is it?
Yeah.
It's a great.
Well, I used to work in California for 20 years, and they used to say, Los Angeles has the best problems in America.
Maybe not, maybe Cambridge does.
Well, Cambridge has the best problems on the Eastern Shore, and when I say that, it's a compliment, because there's so many bright people trying to make it work down there. And they are creative. In many cases, they're much younger than what we are in other counties. So my fingers are crossed, but we would never make a dime in Cambridge.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just was an extension of our mission.
Yeah, and that's what's so brilliant about it, being able to, get to know communities that don't otherwise have the ability to get to know themselves, so.
I want to make one comment too on some of the slides that you had up there. You said all these newspapers have gone out of business. Well, if you go across the country, you're also seeing a lot of communities that are going out of business.
Yeah. Good point.
And I think that, there has to be a certain level of economic activity in a particular jurisdiction to support different businesses, including newspapers. But we rode our bicycles across the country back in 2017, and we were going through towns out west that were getting rid of their police departments. They were getting rid of their open carry laws on guns. I mean, they were going hand in hand. They were just saying, we're all going to start carrying guns. We can't afford police departments anymore. So we're going to have to be our own law enforcement in the days before that. And you see these little towns that at one point were thriving communities that were just, the Rust Belt of Pennsylvania, all these little towns that are just no longer enough economic activity there just to support any kind of a news organization.
I was going to say, I don't know if Northwestern used Pew Institute for their data, but there are like 80 counties in the United States that have no newspaper, no radio.
That's a lot, yeah.
I mean, the consequences is going to be huge.
Yeah, they are huge.
What
So,
percentage of the country has, internet access?
sorry?
What percentage of the country has internet access?
I don't know the answer to that, but it's not even, it's not 50%.
It's not.
Yeah.
No.
I think it's
not in
broad
the country, no.
Yeah.
It's trying to get, it's interesting. Denise and I we went on 2 different vacations. One was basically the Midwest, okay? And then one was in France, okay? In the Midwest, we were driving around and I would be losing.
Yeah, you can't get coverage.
I would get no coverage. So we stop at a gas station and there are these guys on motorcycles. And I said to them, now they know what they're doing. I walked up to him, I said, so what are you doing for? And he says, you're not trying to use Google or Apple. He said, no, Garmin. It's satellite. He said, that, he said, otherwise you'll have no coverage. And he told us that, luckily I had my, my 12-year-old Garmin that I just put up in and got everything. Last year, we go to France. It was covered. We were in the hinterlands, man. There was internet coverage everywhere. It was incredible. I was astounded by what was going on.
Same with India and China.
We're still the greatest country on earth, right?
Yeah. I think we just don't know it anymore because we don't have any way of finding out, so.
But there's a huge part of our country that's practically vacant.
Right.
Right.
Calvin County is still building out internet, Choptank Electric.
Right.
Eastern Utilities. Eastern Utilities,
We're
got
very
big
lucky
grants
here.
to put
Yeah.
internet out to the 100 area and other unserved.
Yeah.
Like Tillman Island is finally getting fiber optic lines out there.
Yeah, but I'm talking about how big these swaths of our country in the west, and Midwest, that, it's huge. Acres, 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 and acres, and acres, as far as you can see it. from
Sure,
farmland.
not.
So, of course, they're not going to have internet coverage there.
Well,
But you
the
have
wild card in all this is Elon Musk's Starlink. I think he's now up to 6,000 satellites.
Yeah.
And so
Well, look what he's been able to do over war areas.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of what's developing now, and we'll be sort of in this
If he
last.
decides to turn it off.
Yeah, exactly, that's dangerous.
That's the part that people forget. Yeah, Starlink is wonderful when he decides to turn it on.
I know.
When he decides to turn it off.
And,
If he likes
yeah,
to do
down the
that.
control, right.
Yeah, he does.
You know, yeah, well, it's been a pleasure having you all here for the last couple of weeks. I think it's kind of fun to think about fun and also worrisome to think about what's happening with democracy. And just, they're not teaching civics, we're not getting this, sort of connection with our neighbors through local news, and all we're doing is listening to national news, which is very partisan. So at least you've got some food for thought now, kind of how you consume your news and where you get it from. I hope you all take out subscriptions to the Star Down, because even though they're struggling, they need your help. Right? And maybe they could kind of.
I get lots of course ideas reading through the articles in there.
Yeah.
Oh, look who's doing that, I should ask them if they'll do a course for us.
Yeah. Do you guys have any more questions for Dennis or David before we go?
Oh, she writes it.
Oh, she does. Anybody?
Oh, it's great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.